So I wanted to talk a little bit more about this idea that the amount of raw data with which the student is presented with nowadays in Jiu-Jitsu has been growing exponentially, and but the amount of structure that organizes this data hasn't been growing really in most gyms, at least, and for I would say for most coaches, right? Um, I like to give a slightly outlandish comparison, and I think that Jiu-Jitsu is experiencing now something that is actually pretty common in the history of science and the history of sort of scientific disciplines in general, because um, there's sciences throughout history has often reached a point of their development in which the growing mass of empirical data just simply was too big for the processing, the information processing techniques that the science in itself had at a certain point in time. And so a perfect example for this would be the development of geography in the beginning around the 1800. This is, again, it's a slightly outlandish comparison for Jiu-Jitsu, but I think it kind of fits the situation, because what happened is that what was known as a topical classification, this idea that you had to organize geographic knowledge in, just bouts and sort of chunks of information that the student was supposed to just sort of remember. And so in manuals, sort of late 1700s geographical manuals, you would find things like, oh, what's the highest mountain in Germany? What should you know about Granada? And with which states does Brazil? It's all this sort of things, right? And now, obviously, that only goes so far, okay? Because what's been happening, what happened at the end of the 1700s, in the beginning of the 19th century, is that the amount of information that geography had to organize in this fashion, this by then already outdated fashion, was just too big. New travels, new exploration, just new desire to just go out, obviously imperial enterprises. And so the underlying structure that geography had at the beginning of the 1800s to deal with this sort of overload of information that was pouring into European science from all over the globe was just simply too much. And so basically the discipline collapsed on itself, and the methods that the discipline had to deal with this growing mass of information were just simply not enough. And so this is what led to a different approach to geography, and because eventually collapsed under its own weight, under the weight of its own growing information, of its own sort of growing raw sheer amount of data. And I think in a way this is a little bit what's been happening in Jiu-Jitsu. I think that in Jiu-Jitsu we have witnessed an overload of information, right? And if you open Instagram, you could see what I mean. Like, if you follow some grappling Jiu-Jitsu account, you will see what I mean. Just sort of almost like Jiu-Jitsu diarrhea, like an enormous amount of just positions that are completely disorganized, and the student, especially as a beginner, you're just sort of supposed to remember bits and pieces there, and obviously it's terrible, and what's happening is it's been collapsing under its own weight, and especially because obviously most social media formats in which Jiu-Jitsu is often shown, they don't really allow for sort of well-structured content. Think about 90 seconds of an Instagram reel and all these sort of things. And so what's been happening is that obviously as a beginner, you sort of walk in the room with these bits and pieces of information that nobody is taking the time to organize for you. And so you just open Instagram, and what you see is just more raw data that are sort of pouring into your phone and your attention from all over the world. And what's happening is this probably you as a beginner, you're sort of collapsing under the weight of this sort of overload of information. And so again, to come back to the point that I made in the previous video, I think that I take my job as a coach to go in both directions, as in, on one side, I want to reduce the amount of information that the student is presented with, and so sort of limit the the information overload that sometimes we experience when we first start jiu-jitsu. But on the other hand, increase the amount of structure and organizations in which this data has been presented. And I think that this, with the slightly outlandish comparison, I think this is a task for the years to come, rather than, you know, adding more stuff. I think has to do with reducing the amount of stuff and increases the amount of organization in which this stuff is presented.